Dorothy Sullivan's arthritic fingers froze on the cabin door handle, her morning coffee mug slipping from her other hand and shattering against the wooden porch. Through the swirling Colorado snowstorm, a massive grizzly bear dragged a blood-stained burlap sack directly toward her front steps. This wasn't a territorial display or food scavenging. The dying animal's eyes held desperate intelligence. Sarah's frantic voice crackled through the phone inside. "Mom, are you there? The roads are completely—" The line went dead as Dorothy watched the bear collapse, its final breath releasing the sack's contents onto her doormat. A small bear cub tumbled out, wearing what looked impossibly like a child's medical alert bracelet, its tiny paws reaching toward Dorothy with an almost human gesture of trust. The 78-year-old retired nurse's weathered hands trembled as 40 years of buried secrets crashed into this moment because she recognized that bracelet, and the coordinates etched into its surface would lead straight back to the family she thought she'd lost forever. What had this dying mother delivered to her doorstep on Christmas Eve? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Sullivan had lived through enough winters in the Colorado Rockies to know when death was knocking at her door. At 78, she'd buried a husband, lost a son, and watched countless patients slip away during her 40-year nursing career at Denver Children's Hospital. But this Christmas Eve morning, death had arrived with 4 paws and a message she couldn't ignore. The inherited cabin had been her sanctuary for the past decade, ever since George's funeral and the revelation that their son Tommy hadn't died in that car accident after all. He'd simply vanished from the hospital with amnesia, leaving behind only medical bills and unanswered questions. The insurance money had long since disappeared into private investigator fees and false leads. Now Dot survived on a modest pension and the stubborn belief that God helps those who help themselves, even when those hands shake from chemotherapy she'd been hiding from everyone. The pancreatic cancer diagnosis had come 3 months ago, tucked between routine blood work and Dr. Martinez's gentle suggestion that she get her affairs in order. 6 months to live, maybe less. She'd told no one, not even Sarah Mitchell Thompson, the wildlife veterinarian who'd become like a daughter after responding to a bear call on Dot's property 5 years ago. Sarah had been visiting regularly ever since, bringing her 6-year-old son Michael for weekend adventures that filled the cabin with laughter Dot hadn't heard since Tommy was small. Benjamin Crawford had been circling her property more frequently lately, the head forest ranger's truck appearing whenever she needed firewood chopped or her generator checked. At 52, Ben carried himself with the careful precision of a man who'd traded his hunting rifle for a badge and never quite forgiven himself for the transition. His younger brother Bobby still ran some kind of business from town, something involving exotic animals that made Ben's jaw tighten whenever the subject arose. The Crawford brothers had grown up rough, everyone knew that. Their parents died in a house fire when they were children, leaving them to bounce between foster homes until they aged out of the system. Dot remembered treating burns on a young boy at the hospital decades ago, a quiet child who'd saved his little brother from the flames but never spoke about the scars that covered half his back. She'd never connected that patient to Ben until recently, when she'd glimpsed those same distinctive burn marks when he'd helped her move a fallen tree. Now, staring at the medical bracelet around the bear cub's tiny paw, Dot felt the familiar chill of recognition that had guided her through countless medical emergencies. The coordinates engraved on the metal matched a location she'd written down weeks ago, the same address where Sarah had mentioned treating injured wildlife for a private collector who paid in cash and asked no questions. The cub's dark eyes held intelligence that made her grandmother's heart ache with possibility and dread in equal measure. The bear cub's first act wasn't to cry or cower, it was to reach up and gently touch Dot's weathered cheek with one tiny paw, leaving a streak of warmth against her cold skin. She'd delivered hundreds of babies during her nursing career, but nothing had prepared her for the profound intelligence in those dark brown eyes. This wasn't just survival instinct. This was recognition. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, sinking to her knees beside the sack. The mama bear's body lay motionless now, her massive frame creating a windbreak against the howling storm. Snow collected in the thick fur around wounds that told a story of desperation. Bullet grazes, rope burns around her neck, and raw patches where a cage had rubbed her skin bloody. This mother had fought through hell to deliver her baby to safety. The medical bracelet caught the pale morning light as Dot examined it more closely. The coordinates were hand-engraved in crude numbers, 39.7392 dig N, 105.178 dig GBW. Below them, scratched in barely legible letters, "Save the children." Her hands trembled as she recognized the handwriting, the same careful script she'd seen on get-well cards and thank-you notes over the years from families whose children she'd helped save. The cub made a soft, chittering sound and crawled toward the cabin door, pawing at the handle with surprising dexterity. When Dot didn't immediately follow, he turned back to her and performed what could only be described as sign language. Simple gestures she'd taught to special needs children decades ago. Point to self, point to door, clasp paws together in a plea. "Lord have mercy," Dot breathed. "Where did you learn that?" Inside the warm cabin, the cub immediately sought out the corner where Dot kept Michael's toys from his weekend visits. He selected a small stuffed bear, Michael's favorite, and carried it to the couch, arranging it carefully before curling up beside it. The behavior was so deliberately nurturing that Dot felt tears burning her eyes. The phone rang, making them both jump. Sarah's voice carried panic even through the static. "Mom, I've been trying to reach you for an hour. The storm knocked out most of the cell towers, but I managed to get through on the landline. Are you okay up there?" "Sarah, honey, I need you to come up here as soon as you can manage it safely. The roads are pretty rough, but I've got the four-wheel drive. Is everything all right? You sound strange." Dot looked at the cub, who had positioned himself between her and the door like a tiny guardian. "Just come, sweetheart. And bring your medical bag, the big one." An hour later, Sarah's Jeep churned up the snowy driveway, chains clanking against the wheel wells. Michael's excited face appeared in the passenger window before the vehicle had fully stopped. At 6 years old, he possessed the fearless curiosity that made every adventure an expedition. "Grandma Dot!" Michael called, bundling out of the Jeep in his oversized winter coat. He stopped short when he saw the mama bear's body, his expression shifting from excitement to solemn understanding. "Is she sleeping?" "She's with the angels now, sweetheart," Dot said gently. Sarah emerged from the driver's seat, her veterinarian's eye immediately cataloging the scene. At 35, she moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. Her divorce 6 months ago had left her more protective of Michael and more dependent on Dot's steady presence in their lives. "Jesus, Dot, what happened here? Come inside. There's someone I want you to meet." The moment Michael stepped into the cabin, the cub stood up and walked directly to him. Sarah instinctively moved to intercede, but stopped when she saw the interaction unfold. The cub sat down in front of Michael and gently touched the boy's hand, the same gesture he'd made with Dot. "Mama," Michael whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "It's him. It's the bear that saved me." Sarah's face went white. 6 months ago, Michael had wandered away from their campsite at Bear Creek and fallen into a rocky ravine. When the search party found him 18 hours later, he'd been warm and uninjured, claiming a baby bear had stayed with him all night and led the rescuers to his location. Everyone had dismissed it as a frightened child's imagination. "That's impossible," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. The cub looked up at her and performed the same sign language sequence. Point to self, point to Michael. Clasp paws together. Then he walked to Michael's stuffed bear, picked it up, and brought it to Sarah like an offering. "He remembers me," Michael said with absolute certainty. "He told me his name is Lucky." As if responding to his name, the cub chittered softly and curled up against Michael's legs. The medical bracelet gleamed against his dark fur, its coordinates pointing toward answers that Dot suspected would change everything she thought she knew about family, sacrifice, and the lengths a mother would go to save her children. The sound of boots on the front porch made Lucky's ears perk up instantly. The cub positioned himself between Michael and the door, a low rumble emanating from his small chest that seemed far too mature for his size. Sarah instinctively pulled Michael closer while Dot moved to the window, her nurse's training kicking in as she assessed potential threats. Benjamin Crawford stood on her porch, his forest ranger uniform dusted with snow and his expression uncharacteristically tense. Behind him, tire tracks and the fresh powder suggested he hadn't come alone, though no other vehicles were visible from this angle. "Ben," Dot called through the door. "What brings you up here in this weather?" "Got reports of bear activity, Miss Dot. Some folks down in town heard shots fired up this way around dawn." His voice carried the careful neutrality of official business, but something underneath suggested personal concern. "Mind if I come in and check that you're all right?" Sarah shot Dot a meaningful look. They both knew that Lucky's presence would raise questions they weren't prepared to answer. But the alternative, leaving Ben standing in the storm while potentially dangerous people roamed the area, seemed worse. "Come on in, son. But fair warning, we've got some unusual circumstances here." Ben stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots, and froze when he saw Lucky nestled against Michael. His hand instinctively moved toward his radio, then stopped as he took in the scene more carefully. The medical bracelet, the cub's calm demeanor, the protective way he'd positioned himself. "Well, I'll be damned," Ben said quietly. "That's the cub from the Hartwell rescue operation." "The what now?" Sarah asked. Ben removed his hat, running fingers through graying hair as he seemed to weigh his words. "About 8 months ago, we got reports of illegal animal trafficking up near Copper Mountain. When we finally tracked down the operation, we found dozens of exotic animals, most in terrible condition. There was a pregnant grizzly among them, but she escaped during the raid." He looked down at Lucky with something approaching wonder. "We assumed she died in the wilderness." "She did die," Dot said softly. "Just this morning, right outside my door." The implications hung heavy in the warm air. Ben's expression shifted from official interest to something more personal, more painful. "Miss Dot, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive me if it seems out of line." "Go ahead, son." "Do you remember treating a boy at Denver Children's Hospital about 40 years ago? House fire victims, 2 brothers. The older one had burns covering half his back." Dot's breath caught. She studied Ben's face more carefully, seeing past the weathered features and gray beard to the scared 10-year-old she'd comforted through months of painful skin grafts and physical therapy. "Benjamin Crawford, you were so brave, honey. Never cried once, not even during the worst of it. You just kept asking if your little brother was going to be okay." "Bobby was only 6 then. I promised him I'd always protect him." Ben's voice cracked slightly. "I'm afraid I haven't done such a good job keeping that promise." Sarah looked between them, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "What does this have to do with Lucky?" "Because the trafficking operation we busted? It was run by my brother." The confession fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Lucky seemed to sense the tension, moving closer to Michael while keeping his dark eyes fixed on Ben. "Bobby's been struggling since his accident," Ben continued. "Hunting incident about 15 years ago left him paralyzed from the waist down. He was always angry after that, felt like the world owed him something." I guess I was too busy trying to fix everything to see how far down the wrong path he'd gone. The coordinates on Lucky's bracelet, Dot said quietly. They lead to one of his operations, don't they? Ben nodded grimly. Abandoned mining facility about 20 miles north of here. We've been watching it for weeks, but Bobby's smart. Every time we get close, the place is clean. It's like he knows we're coming. Because he does know, Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. Ben, who else knows you've been investigating this? Just my supervisor and the Federal Wildlife Task Force. Why? Because someone's been tracking animal rescues in this area for months. I've had clients paying cash for emergency veterinary work, always at odd hours, always with animals showing signs of captivity stress. I thought I was helping legitimate wildlife rehabilitators. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Bobby hadn't just been running a trafficking operation. He'd been using Sarah's compassionate nature to provide medical care for his stolen animals, probably through intermediaries she'd never suspected were connected to illegal activity. Lucky suddenly stood up, his small body rigid with alert attention. Outside, the sound of vehicles approached through the storm, multiple engines moving slowly but deliberately up the mountain road toward Dot's cabin. They're coming for him, Ben said, reaching for his radio. Bobby must have tracked the mama bear here. No, Dot said firmly, moving to block his path to the radio. If you call this in now, Lucky becomes evidence. They'll put him in a cage while lawyers and bureaucrats decide his fate. That's not what his mama died for. Miss Dot, I understand your feelings, but Benjamin Crawford, you listen to me. Dot's voice carried the authority of 40 years spent making life and death decisions. 40 years ago, I made you a promise. I told you that as long as there was breath in my body, I wouldn't let anything bad happen to your little brother. I kept that promise then, even when it cost me my job to fight for the experimental treatment that saved his life. Ben's face went pale. The experimental burn treatment, the one that insurance wouldn't cover. You paid for that? Blood is thicker than water, son, but sometimes water runs deeper than blood. You boys became my family the day you walked into that hospital, and family protects family. The sound of engines grew closer. Through the window they could see headlights cutting through the swirling snow. 3 black SUVs emerged from the tree line like predators stalking through the snow, their tinted windows reflecting the pale winter light. Ben's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he positioned himself between the approaching vehicles and the cabin's occupants. Lucky pressed closer to Michael, his small body trembling with an alertness that seemed to recognize danger on a primal level. Sarah, take Michael and Lucky to the back bedroom, Dot commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to crisis management. Stay there until I tell you it's safe. I'm not leaving you, Sarah protested, but Dot's steel-gray eyes brooked no argument. You'll do as I say, young lady. That child and that cub are the most important things in this cabin right now. The vehicle stopped in a semicircle around the cabin, engines idling. Car doors slammed shut in quick succession, followed by the crunch of boots on snow. Through the frost-covered windows they could see at least 6 figures moving with military precision, surrounding the building. A familiar voice called out through the storm, "Ben! I know you're in there, brother. Come on out so we can talk." Ben's shoulders sagged with recognition and pain. "Bobby." 40 years, Dot whispered, watching her carefully constructed piece crumble. 40 years I've been praying for God to bring families back together, and this is how he answers. The front door rattled under a heavy knock. "Miss Dorothy Sullivan," a different voice called, younger and harder than Bobby's. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests that have a legal claim to property currently in your possession." "Legal claim, my ass," Ben muttered, checking his radio only to find static. "They're jamming communications. Lucky's ears perked up at something the humans couldn't hear. He padded quietly to the back window and stood on his hind legs, pawing at the glass. Through the bedroom door, they could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath. "Dot, there are more vehicles coming up the back access road. This isn't just about Lucky, this is a coordinated operation." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Bobby hadn't just tracked his escaped merchandise. He'd planned an ambush designed to eliminate witnesses and recover his assets. The mama bear's final journey hadn't been random desperation. It had been a calculated gambit to reach the one person Bobby couldn't openly threaten without destroying what remained of his relationship with Ben. "Miss Sullivan," Marcus called again, his tone growing impatient. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. The bear cub belongs to us, and we have documentation to prove it." "Documentation?" Dot called back, playing for time while her mind raced through options. "From what authority?" "Private wildlife rehabilitation permit filed with the state. The animal was legally purchased from a certified breeding facility and is currently on loan to our research program." Ben's face darkened. Forged paperwork. Bobby always was good with details when it suited him. The sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen. Someone had smashed the window over the sink. Lucky immediately began making distressed, chittering sounds that seemed to communicate urgent information to Sarah. She appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face pale but determined. "They're not just here for Lucky," she reported quietly. "I can see tranquilizer equipment. They're planning to take him alive, but they've also got cattle prods and restraint devices that suggest they don't care about his welfare." "And the rest of us?" Ben asked grimly. "I count 12 men total, all armed." "This isn't a recovery operation, it's a cleanup crew." Dot felt the familiar calm that had always settled over her during medical emergencies. Her cancer might be eating away at her body, but her mind remained sharp, and she'd survived too much to let fear cloud her judgment now. "Benjamin, I need you to listen carefully," she said, moving to the old cedar chest where she kept her late husband's hunting equipment. "Your brother is out there, but he's not the same boy I helped save 40 years ago. The Bobby I knew would never put a child in danger." "Miss Dot, what are you doing?" She pulled out George's rifle, a Winchester 30-06 that hadn't been fired in a decade but was still meticulously maintained. "I'm reminding myself that sometimes the best way to help someone you love is to stop them from doing something they can never take back." Lucky suddenly bolted from the bedroom, darting between their legs to reach the front door. Instead of cowering or hiding, he stood tall and began making a series of complex vocalizations that sounded almost like conversation. The sounds carried clearly through the thin cabin walls. "Jesus Christ," Marcus's voice drifted in from outside. "Did you hear that?" "He's calling for backup," Sarah breathed. In the wild, bear cubs use specific distress calls to summon adult protection. But Lucky's calls are more sophisticated. He's describing the threat. As if summoned by her words, deep answering rumbles echoed from the forest surrounding the cabin. Not one voice, but many. The sounds grew closer, and through the windows they could see dark shapes moving among the trees, massive forms that made even the approaching vehicles seem small and vulnerable. "What the hell?" Marcus's voice carried genuine fear now. Bobby's voice cut through the confusion. "It's just noise, Marcus. Wild bears don't coordinate attacks." "Shoot the first one you see and the rest will scatter." But Ben was shaking his head, wonder replacing fear in his expression. "Miss Dot, I think Lucky just called his extended family to a reunion." The adult bears emerged from the tree line like shadows gaining substance. A massive male grizzly, scarred and gray-muzzled, led a group of at least 8 adults. They moved with purpose rather than aggression, positioning themselves strategically around the cabin's perimeter. The largest female, easily 600 pounds, approached the spot where Lucky's mama lay and touched the body gently with her snout before raising her head to release a mournful call that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. "Pack it up!" Bobby's voice carried panic now. "We're leaving!" "What about the merchandise?" Marcus demanded. "The merchandise isn't worth our lives. Move!" But it was too late. The adult bears had positioned themselves between the vehicles and the access roads, effectively trapping the human intruders. Unlike the Hollywood depictions of raging monsters, these bears displayed calculated intelligence. They didn't attack, they simply waited, their presence communicating a message that transcended species barriers. Lucky padded back to Michael, who had emerged from the bedroom despite his mother's protests. The 6-year-old knelt down and wrapped his arms around the cub's neck. "I told you I'd keep you safe," Michael whispered. "Families stick together." Through the front window, they watched Bobby Crawford wheel his chair closer to the cabin, his face a mask of desperation and rage. Behind him, his men were discovering that their vehicles wouldn't start. Whether due to the cold or something more deliberate, the engines refused to turn over. "Ben!" Bobby called out, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that took them all back to the scared 6-year-old who had clung to his older brother's hand through months of recovery. "Please, brother, I need this. Emma needs this." "Emma?" Sarah asked quietly. Ben's face crumpled with understanding. "His daughter. She's been sick. Some kind of rare heart condition. The medical bills must be destroying him." "So he decided to destroy everything else first," Dot said, but her voice carried more sadness than anger. "Bobby Crawford, you get yourself up to this porch right now. We need to have a conversation." "Miss Dot, I don't think—" "Hush, Benjamin. Sometimes a family crisis requires family intervention, and like it or not, we're all family here." The standoff continued for several tense minutes before Bobby finally approached the cabin, his men trailing nervously behind him while keeping fearful eyes on the surrounding bears. When he reached the porch, Dot opened the door and stepped outside, her slight frame dwarfed by the massive Winchester in her hands. "Hello, Bobby," she said gently. "It's been too long." At 48, Bobby Crawford looked like a man who had aged far beyond his years. The wheelchair was top of the line, but his face carried the deep lines of chronic pain and constant struggle. When he looked up at Dot, his expression cycled through surprise, shame, and desperate hope. "Miss Sullivan, I never thought I'd see you again." "Life has a way of bringing people back together when they need each other most," Dot replied. "Now, why don't you tell me about Emma?" Bobby's carefully constructed mask of criminal authority crumbled the moment Dot mentioned his daughter's name. His hands gripped the wheelchair's armrests so tightly his knuckles went white, and when he spoke, his voice carried the raw desperation of a father watching his child slip away. "She's 12 years old, Miss Sullivan. 12 years old, and she's dying." The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for months. "Hypoplastic left heart syndrome, born with half a heart, and now that half is failing. She needs a transplant, but we're not high enough on the list, and the experimental treatments." He laughed bitterly. $200,000 for a chance? Just a chance. Ben stepped forward, his ranger training warring with brotherly concern. "Bobby, why didn't you tell me? We could have found another way." "Another way?" Bobby's voice cracked with years of accumulated rage. "You mean like the way you found another solution when I was lying in that hospital bed, paralyzed from the waist down because I followed you on one of your hunting expeditions? Or like the way you found another solution when our parents died and we had nowhere to go?" The accusation hung in the cold air like a physical blow. Around them, the massive bears maintained their protective circle, but their attention seemed focused on something beyond the immediate human drama. Lucky pressed closer to Michael, his small body trembling with an awareness that the adults were too focused on their confrontation to notice. "That's not fair, Bobby. Ben said quietly. The accident. The accident happened because you insisted we track that wounded grizzly into the canyon. You said it was our responsibility as hunters to finish what we started. I was 24 years old and trusted my big brother to keep me safe. Dot watched the exchange with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades mediating family crises in hospital waiting rooms. She could see the truth buried beneath 40 years of resentment and guilt. Two boys who had never properly grieved their parents' deaths, never learned to forgive each other for surviving when so many others hadn't. Emma doesn't know about any of this, Bobby continued, his voice breaking. She thinks her daddy runs a legitimate wildlife sanctuary. Every time she asks me why the donation money hasn't come through yet for her surgery, I have to look into those trusting eyes and lie. Do you have any idea what that does to a man? Sarah had been listening from the doorway, her veterinarian's training helping her recognize the signs of a family in crisis. Bobby, the animals we've been treating, some of them were stolen from families, weren't they? From people who loved them? They were merchandise, Bobby said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rich people's exotic pets, destined for private collections anyway. I told myself I was just redistributing wealth. You told yourself a lot of things, Dot observed gently. Just like you told yourself that pushing your brother away would somehow make your pain hurt less. Marcus Webb shifted nervously behind Bobby, his hand moving toward his jacket. We need to wrap this up, Crawford. The longer we stay here, the more complications we create. Complications? Lucky suddenly chittered, and everyone turned to look at the cub. He was standing alert, his small head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Then he began making the same complex vocalizations he'd used earlier, but with greater urgency. What's he doing? Marcus demanded. Sarah's face went pale as she interpreted Lucky's behavior. He's warning us. Something's coming that he considers a bigger threat than any of us. The sound reached them a moment later, helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air, growing steadily louder. Through the trees they could see searchlights sweeping across the snow-covered landscape, methodically quartering the area around Dot's cabin. Federal Wildlife Task Force, Ben said grimly. Bobby, how did they track us here? They didn't track us, Marcus said, pulling out a satellite phone. They tracked the GPS signal from the cub's medical bracelet. I've been feeding them information about your location for weeks. The betrayal hit Bobby like a physical blow. You son of a bitch. You were supposed to be working for me. I work for whoever pays better, Marcus replied, backing toward the tree line. And the federal bounty on your trafficking operation is worth more than whatever you were planning to pay me for this job. Ben's radio crackled to life as communications cleared. All units, this is Task Force Leader Agent Harrison. We have confirmed illegal wildlife trafficking in progress at coordinates 39.7392 north, 105.0178 west. All suspects should be considered armed and dangerous. The coordinates from Lucky's bracelet, Sarah realized. Marcus has been using the cub as bait to lure Bobby into a trap. The adult bears began moving with greater urgency, their protective formation tightening around the cabin. The massive matriarch approached Bobby's wheelchair directly, her intelligent eyes studying him with an intensity that made the armed men behind him step backward in fear. Jesus Christ, it's going to attack, one of Bobby's men whispered, raising his tranquilizer gun. No, Dot said firmly, stepping between the weapon and the bear. She's trying to tell us something. The great bear turned toward the forest where Lucky's mother lay, then back to Bobby, making a soft rumbling sound that seemed almost conversational. Lucky responded with his own vocalizations, creating what could only be described as a dialogue between species. She knows, Michael said with the startling clarity that sometimes comes from children. She knows about Emma. That's impossible, Marcus scoffed, but his voice carried uncertainty. Bobby looked up at the massive bear, tears streaming down his weathered face. My little girl is dying, and I've done terrible things trying to save her. I've become the kind of man who steals babies from their mothers. The bear stepped closer, lowering her great head until she was eye level with Bobby. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and beast regarded each other with mutual recognition of loss and desperation. Then the bear gently touched Bobby's hand with her snout, not aggression but acknowledgement. "She forgives you," Dot whispered. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The helicopters were closer now, their searchlights beginning to sweep the immediate area around the cabin. Marcus had disappeared into the forest, leaving Bobby's remaining men to face the approaching federal agents without their promised backup. "Bobby," Ben said urgently, "there's still time to make this right. Turn yourself in, cooperate with the investigation. Maybe we can work out a deal that helps Emma without destroying what's left of our family." "Our family?" Bobby laughed bitterly. "Ben, we stopped being family the day you chose your career over helping your crippled brother. That's not true, and you know it. I chose to become someone who protects wildlife instead of killing it because I couldn't live with the guilt of what happened to you. Every animal I've saved was my way of trying to make amends for the one that took away your ability to walk." The confession hung between them like a bridge. Neither brother had been brave enough to cross in 15 years. Lucky sensed the emotional shift and moved to position himself between the two men, looking up at each of them in turn before making a soft, questioning sound. "Even the cub knows we belong together," Dot observed. "Animals understand family bonds better than humans sometimes. They don't hold grudges or keep score. They just protect the ones they love." Bobby reached down to touch Lucky's head, his calloused fingers gentle against the soft fur. "I never wanted to hurt innocence. I just wanted to save my daughter." "Then help us save her," Sarah said, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "Bobby, I've been researching Emma's condition since you mentioned it. There are new treatments, experimental protocols that don't require a full transplant. I have contacts at Children's Hospital Colorado who specialize in pediatric cardiology. I can't afford—" "You don't have to afford anything," Dot interrupted. "Some things in this world are still free, son, like the kind of love that makes a mama bear drag her dying body through a snowstorm to save her baby, like the kind of stubbornness that makes an old nurse spend her life savings to help other people's children, like the kind of brotherhood that survives 40 years of misunderstanding and resentment." The searchlights were sweeping closer, and the sound of boots crunching through snow indicated that ground teams were approaching on foot. Bobby's men looked between their boss and the surrounding bears, calculating their odds of escape and finding them wanting. "Last chance, brother," Ben said, extending his hand toward Bobby. "Come home." Bobby looked at the offered hand, then at Lucky, then at the great bear who continued to watch him with patient understanding. "If I surrender, what happens to Emma?" "We take care of her," Dot said simply. "All of us. That's what families do." The federal agents emerged from the tree line like shadows materializing from the storm, their tactical gear and weapons creating a stark contrast against the peaceful winter landscape. Agent Harrison, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, raised her hand to signal her team to halt when she saw the circle of bears surrounding the cabin. "What in God's name?" she breathed, speaking into her radio. "Command, we have an unusual situation here. Multiple adult grizzlies have surrounded the target location. Advise." Bobby's remaining men had thrown down their weapons the moment the federal agents appeared, their bravado evaporating in the face of both human law enforcement and the massive bears that continued to watch them with predatory patience. But it was what happened next that shattered every remaining illusion about family, loyalty, and the lengths people would go to save the ones they loved. From the forest behind the federal agents, a small figure emerged on crutches, moving with determined difficulty through the snow. Emma Crawford, 12 years old and frail from months of medical treatments, had somehow followed the convoy up the mountain road. "Daddy!" she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with heartbreaking clarity. "Daddy, I heard on the police scanner that you were in trouble." Bobby's face went ashen. Of all the scenarios he'd imagined, seeing his daughter witness his downfall in real time had never entered his calculations. "Emma, baby, you shouldn't be here. It's dangerous." "I know about the bears, Daddy. I know about everything." She continued moving toward him, her small frame dwarfed by the massive animals that parted respectfully to let her pass. "I know you've been doing bad things to try to get money for my surgery." The confession hit Bobby like a physical blow. "How long have you known?" "Since the beginning." "I'm not stupid, Daddy. I see the news reports about animal trafficking. I hear you on the phone making deals. I know that the wildlife sanctuary you told me about doesn't really exist." She reached his wheelchair and placed a small hand on his arm. "And I know that you've been killing yourself, trying to save me." Agent Harrison stepped forward, her weapon lowered but ready. "Mr. Crawford, we need you to surrender peacefully. Your daughter doesn't need to see this get ugly." "She's already seen too much," Bobby said, his voice breaking. "Emma, sweetheart, I want you to go with Agent Harrison. Uncle Ben will take care of you while Daddy sorts this out." "No." Emma's voice carried a strength that belied her fragile appearance. "I'm not leaving you, and I'm not letting you sacrifice yourself for me anymore." Lucky had been watching the family drama unfold with the intense focus that marked all his interactions. Now he approached Emma directly, chittering softly as he reached up to touch her hand with his paw. The gesture was gentle, deliberate, and somehow conveying a message that transcended species barriers. "He wants to show me something," Emma said with certainty. "Can I follow him?" "Absolutely not," Agent Harrison said firmly. "That animal is evidence in a federal trafficking case." "That animal," Dot interrupted, stepping forward with her rifle still in hand, "is a victim, just like Emma. And sometimes victims know things that law enforcement doesn't." Lucky moved toward the mama bear's body, Emma following despite her crutches and the protests of every adult present. When they reached the fallen giant, Lucky began making the same complex vocalizations he'd used earlier, but with a different tone, sadder, more reverent. Emma knelt beside the massive bear, her small hand touching the cold fur. "She died trying to save her baby, didn't she?" "Just like Daddy's been dying trying to save me." "Emma, get away from there," Bobby pleaded. "No, Daddy, don't you see? This is what I've been trying to tell you. Sometimes the person you're trying to save doesn't want to be saved at the cost of destroying everything good in the world." The words fell like hammer blows on Bobby's already shattered composure. Around them, the adult bears had begun to move with purpose, not threatening but purposeful. The great matriarch approached Agent Harrison directly, stopping just outside arm's reach and sitting down in what could only be interpreted as a peaceful gesture. "I've never seen anything like this," Agent Harrison murmured. "It's like they're trying to participate in the negotiation." Sarah had been observing the interaction between Emma and Lucky with professional interest. "Agent Harrison, I'm a licensed wildlife veterinarian. What we're witnessing here is unprecedented interspecies communication. These bears aren't just protecting their young, they're trying to mediate a conflict." "Bears don't mediate conflicts, Dr. Mitchell. These bears do." Sarah knelt beside Emma and Lucky. "Emma, what is Lucky trying to tell you?" The 12-year-old girl placed her hand on the cub's back, closing her eyes as if listening to something beyond words. "He says his mama brought him here because she knew Miss Dot would take care of him. She knew that families protect each other even when it's hard, even when it costs everything. Lucky chittered softly and moved to Bobby's wheelchair, placing his small paws on the man's knees and looking up into his face with those impossibly intelligent dark eyes. Then he did something that made every person present catch their breath. He reached up and gently touched the tears on Bobby's cheek, just as he had done with Dot hours earlier. "He forgives you," Emma whispered. "They all forgive you." "But you have to forgive yourself, Daddy." Bobby looked around the circle of faces, federal agents, his estranged brother, the woman who had saved his life 40 years ago, his dying daughter, and a bear cub who somehow embodied every innocent life he'd endangered in his desperate quest to save the one life that mattered most to him. "I surrender," he said quietly. "I surrender completely." Agent Harrison stepped forward with restraints, but Dot raised her rifle slightly, not threatening, just commanding attention. "Agent Harrison, before you take Bobby into custody, I have something to say that might affect your case." Dot's voice carried the authority of someone used to being heard. 40 years ago, I violated hospital protocol to save this man's life. I used experimental treatments that weren't approved, forged insurance paperwork, and spent my own money to pay for procedures that gave him a chance to live. I broke the law to save a child just like he broke the law to save his child. Miss Sullivan, that's not really relevant to... It's completely relevant, because the difference between what I did and what Bobby did isn't the law we broke. It's the support system we had. I had a husband who backed my decisions, colleagues who covered for me, and supervisors who looked the other way when bureaucracy got in the way of saving lives. Bobby had none of that. He had a brother who blamed himself for Bobby's accident, a medical system that priced compassion out of reach, and a society that treats animal trafficking as worse than letting children die for lack of money. The indictment of systemic failure hung in the cold air like a challenge to everyone present. Agent Harrison looked uncomfortable, her training warring with the emotional complexity of the situation. "Miss Sullivan, I understand your point, but the law is the law." "The law," Emma said suddenly, her young voice carrying surprising strength, "should protect families, not destroy them." Lucky made a sound that seemed almost like agreement, and incredibly, the great matriarch bear responded with her own rumbling vocalization. The other adult bears began moving closer, not aggressively but with clear intention, forming a tighter circle around the humans. "Jesus," one of the federal agents whispered. "It's like they're holding court." "Maybe they are," Ben said, wonder in his voice. "Maybe they understand something about justice that we've forgotten." Bobby reached out and pulled Emma close, his strong arms encircling his frail daughter. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm sorry I became someone you couldn't be proud of. I was always proud of you, Daddy. But I was also scared that saving me would kill you." She looked up at Agent Harrison with the direct gaze of a child who had grown up too fast. "Agent Harrison, my daddy did bad things, but he did them for love. Doesn't that count for something?" The question hung in the air as the snow continued to fall around them, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything seem possible and nothing seem simple. The revelation came not from any of the humans present, but from Lucky himself. As Emma held her father and the federal agents debated jurisdiction, the bear cub began making sounds none of them had heard before, a series of complex vocalizations that seemed almost like speech. Sarah recognized it first, her veterinarian training helping her decode what others might dismiss as animal noise. "He's not just communicating," she whispered. "He's telling a story." Lucky moved deliberately between Emma and the great matriarch bear, positioning himself so both could see his gestures clearly. He began what could only be described as a performance, pointing to the mama bear's body, then to himself, then to the cabin, then to Emma. His vocalizations grew more urgent, more specific. "What's he doing?" Agent Harrison asked, her professional skepticism warring with growing fascination. "He's explaining what happened," Dot said with sudden understanding. "He's testifying." The adult bears began responding to Lucky's story with their own sounds, rumbles of agreement, huffs of emphasis, and what seemed like questions. The great matriarch approached Emma directly, her massive head lowering until she was eye level with the girl. "She wants to show me something," Emma said, reaching out to touch the bear's scarred snout. "There's something about Lucky that we don't understand." What happened next defied every assumption about wildlife behavior any of them had ever held. The matriarch bear turned and began walking toward the forest, pausing every few steps to look back at the humans. Lucky chittered urgently and began following her, clearly expecting the others to do the same. "We can't just follow wild bears into the woods," Agent Harrison protested. "We can't not follow," Ben said, holstering his weapon. "If Lucky wants to show us something, it might be evidence that changes everything." The procession that made its way through the snow-laden forest defied description. Federal agents, local law enforcement, a wildlife trafficker in a wheelchair, his dying daughter, an elderly nurse with a rifle, and a veterinarian followed a group of grizzly bears deeper into the Colorado wilderness. The adult bears moved with purpose, creating a protective corridor around the humans, while Lucky trotted ahead like a tour guide. After 20 minutes of careful travel, they emerged into a clearing that took everyone's breath away. Hidden among the trees was what appeared to be a natural amphitheater, a circular depression surrounded by massive boulders and ancient pines, but it wasn't the geography that stunned them, it was what occupied the space. Dozens of animals moved freely throughout the clearing. Not just bears, but elk, deer, foxes, and even a pair of mountain lions that should have been mortal enemies of the smaller creatures. At the center of it all stood a makeshift structure that looked like a combination of veterinary clinic and wildlife rehabilitation center. "Jesus Christ," Agent Harrison breathed. "What is this place?" And voice answered from behind them, familiar yet impossible. "It's what Bobby thought he was creating before greed and desperation twisted his vision into something ugly." They turned to see a man emerging from behind one of the boulders, and Ben's world shifted on its axis. The figure was tall, lean, with graying hair and eyes the same color as Ben's own. Scars crisscrossed his face and hands, and he moved with the careful gait of someone who had suffered serious injuries but refused to let them define his limitations. "Tommy?" Dot's voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, Mom," Tommy Sullivan said, and the word "Mom" fell like a stone into still water, sending shock waves through everyone present. Sarah's face went white as the implications hit her. "Mom? Dot, you said Tommy was dead? I thought he was dead." Dot's legs gave out and she sank to her knees in the snow. "The accident, the hospital said John Doe with severe head trauma had disappeared from the long-term care facility," Tommy said gently, approaching his mother with the caution of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I didn't remember who I was for almost 10 years. By the time my memory started coming back, I'd built a new life as a wildlife rehabilitator. I thought it would be easier for everyone if Tommy Sullivan stayed dead." Ben stared at the man who had been the subject of countless search efforts over the past decade. "You've been here the whole time, working with illegal wildlife trafficking?" "Working against it," Tommy corrected. "This facility rehabilitates animals that have been stolen from their families, traumatized by captivity, or injured during illegal transport. Lucky's mama was one of ours. She escaped from Bobby's operation 6 months ago, pregnant and wounded. We've been tracking her ever since." Lucky chittered excitedly and ran to Tommy, who knelt down to embrace the cub with obvious affection. "Lucky was born here. But his mama never forgot the trauma of captivity. When she realized she was dying, she knew he needed protection from a different kind of family. She brought him to me, Dot said, understanding flooding her voice. She brought him to the woman who raised the man who taught her that humans could be trusted. I've been telling the animals stories about you for years, Mom. About the nurse who fought bureaucracy to save children, who spent her own money when insurance companies failed, who never gave up on anyone who still had a chance. Agent Harrison looked between Tommy and the thriving wildlife sanctuary with professional confusion. Mr. Sullivan, if this operation is legitimate, why isn't it registered with federal wildlife authorities? Because federal wildlife authorities have been compromised, Tommy said bluntly. Bobby's trafficking network had contacts inside the system, people who would tip him off whenever legitimate rehabilitation efforts threatened his business. This facility exists in legal gray area specifically to protect animals from corrupt officials. That's a serious accusation, Agent Harrison said. It's a serious problem. Lucky's medical bracelet wasn't just tracking equipment, it was evidence. The coordinates led to Bobby's operation, but they also contained encrypted data about every corrupt official who had been taking bribes to look the other way. Bobby, who had been silent throughout the revelations, finally spoke. Tommy, I never knew about your facility. If I had, you would have what? Stopped stealing babies from their mothers? Stopped traumatizing innocent animals for profit? Tommy's voice carried years of accumulated anger. Bobby, I know about Emma. I know about her condition, her need for surgery, your desperate financial situation. But you made the choice to solve your family's problems by destroying other families. I didn't know what else to do, Bobby said, his voice breaking. The medical bills, the insurance denials, the waiting lists. Emma was dying, and nobody cared. I cared, Dot said quietly. I've been funding experimental treatments for pediatric heart conditions for the past 5 years, Bobby. Anonymous donations through the hospital foundation. If you'd asked for help instead of assuming you had to steal it, you've been paying for other people's children while I was committing crimes to save mine. I've been paying for all the children I couldn't reach directly, honey, including yours. The confession shattered what remained of Bobby's emotional defenses. Emma wheeled her father's chair closer to Dot, her young face serious with understanding beyond her years. Miss Dot, have you been helping kids like me all along? Every chance I got, sweetheart. It's what your Uncle Ben and your daddy taught me 40 years ago, that every child deserves a chance, regardless of their family's ability to pay for it. Lucky made a soft sound and approached Emma, nuzzling against her hand with obvious affection. The gesture seemed to communicate something that words couldn't express: recognition, acceptance, and a kind of interspecies empathy that transcended the chaos of human motivations. The cub knows, Sarah said with wonder. He knows that Emma's condition makes her like him, a baby who needs protection, care, and family support to survive. Agent Harrison was speaking rapidly into her radio, coordinating with her superiors about the unprecedented situation. When she finished, she turned to address the group with obvious frustration. I've been instructed to treat this as a complex federal case requiring extensive investigation. Mr. Crawford, you're still under arrest for wildlife trafficking, but the charges may be modified based on new evidence. Mr. Sullivan, your facility needs immediate federal inspection and registration. Ms. Sullivan, your funding activities require financial investigation to ensure compliance with charitable giving laws. And Lucky? Emma asked, the question that mattered most to her. Tommy knelt beside his mother and the little girl. Lucky nestled between them like a bridge connecting generations. Lucky gets to choose. He's young enough to be successfully reintegrated into wild bear society, or he can remain here as an ambassador animal, helping us rehabilitate other trafficking victims. What would you choose, Lucky? Emma whispered. The bear cub looked around the circle of faces, human and ursine, young and old, guilty and innocent, and made his decision by curling up in Emma's lap while maintaining eye contact with the great matriarch bear. The massive female approached slowly and touched her nose to Lucky's head in what could only be interpreted as a blessing. "He wants to stay with the family that needs him most," Dot said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Just like his mama did." As the afternoon sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing, a helicopter appeared overhead. But this time it wasn't federal agents, it was a medical transport team summoned by Sarah's earlier radio calls. "Emma Crawford," the lead paramedic called as the aircraft landed. "We're here to transport you to Children's Hospital, Colorado. Dr. Martinez is waiting with a surgical team." "The experimental treatment," Sarah explained to Bobby's confused expression. "I called in every favor I had. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, full funding already arranged through Dot's foundation." Bobby looked from his daughter to his brother to the woman who had saved his life 4 decades earlier. "I don't understand. After everything I've done—" "You're still family," Ben said simply. "And family doesn't give up on family." As the medical team prepared Emma for transport, she insisted on saying goodbye to Lucky properly. The bear cub nuzzled against her cheek, and she whispered something in his ear that made him chitter softly in response. "What did you tell him?" Dot asked. "I told him that when I'm better, I'm going to come back and help take care of all the animals who need families," Emma said. "And I told him that his mama was the bravest mama in the whole world, just like mine would be if she were still alive." The helicopter lifted off as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, carrying Emma toward hope and healing. Below, in the clearing where wild and domestic, guilty and innocent, lost and found had somehow come together, Lucky curled up between Dot and Tommy as the adult bears settled in for the night around them. 40 years, Dot murmured, looking at her son who had been lost and was now found. 40 years I prayed for a Christmas miracle. "Sometimes," Tommy said, stroking Lucky's fur as the cub drifted off to sleep, "miracles come with 4 paws and the courage to bring broken families back together." 6 months later, on a warm June morning that painted the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and green, Dot Sullivan sat on her cabin porch watching Lucky teach Emma Crawford how to identify edible berries. The 12-year-old girl moved with the confident energy of someone whose heart had been repaired not just by surgery, but by the knowledge that she was surrounded by people who would never let her face danger alone. Emma's surgery had been a complete success. Dr. Martinez had called it miraculous. The experimental treatment had not only repaired her damaged heart, but had actually strengthened it beyond normal parameters. She would need regular checkups, but the days of counting heartbeats and rationing energy were behind her. More importantly, the girl who had grown up too fast while watching her father destroy himself to save her had finally been allowed to be a child again. "Lucky, no!" Emma laughed as the now teenage bear cub knocked over the berry basket with his enthusiastic digging. "We're supposed to be gathering food, not playing in it," Lucky responded with what Dot had learned to recognize as his innocent expression. Head tilted, ears perked, dark eyes wide with feigned confusion about how the basket could have possibly overturned itself. Emma wasn't fooled for a second, but she scratched behind his ears anyway because that's what family members do when someone they love makes a mess while trying to help. Bobby Crawford emerged from the cabin using his new prosthetic legs, another gift that had appeared anonymously through hospital channels, though everyone suspected Dot's continued philanthropy. His physical therapy had been grueling, but the motivation to walk alongside his daughter had driven him through months of painful progress. He would never run marathons, but he could stand to hug his child and walk through the forest where she spent her summer days learning about wildlife rehabilitation. "How's the lesson going, teacher?" he asked Emma, his voice carrying the lightness of a man who had learned to live with redemption rather than guilt. Lucky thinks berries are more fun to squish than to eat, Emma reported seriously, but he's getting better at understanding which plants are safe for humans versus safe for bears. Bobby's community service sentence had been converted into full-time work at Tommy's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, now officially registered as the Sullivan Crawford Wildlife Sanctuary. His knowledge of animal trafficking networks had proven invaluable in helping federal agents dismantle similar operations across 3 states. More importantly, his experience with trauma, both causing it and recovering from it, had made him unexpectedly effective at rehabilitating animals who had suffered human cruelty. Ben Crawford walked up from the forest, his ranger uniform replaced by civilian clothes, since officially transferring to work alongside his brother. The federal investigation had revealed extensive corruption within the wildlife management system, leading to a reorganization that had eliminated several positions, including Ben's. Rather than viewing it as a setback, he'd embraced the opportunity to work directly with the animals he'd spent his career trying to protect. "Tommy wants everyone down at the main facility," Ben announced. "We've got visitors coming who want to meet Lucky personally." The visitors turned out to be a delegation from the International Wildlife Protection Alliance, led by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned expert in animal psychology who had traveled from Switzerland specifically to study Lucky's unprecedented behavioral development. What they found challenged every assumption about wildlife intelligence and interspecies communication. "In 40 years of studying animal behavior," Dr. Vasquez said, watching Lucky demonstrate his ability to open complex latches and operate simple tools, "I have never seen cognitive development like this. Lucky isn't just intelligent, he's adaptive in ways that suggest genuine understanding of cause and effect, emotional consequence, and social responsibility." Lucky seemed to understand that he was being evaluated. He performed his usual repertoire of skills, opening doors, using basic sign language, demonstrating problem-solving abilities, but he also did something new. He approached Dr. Vasquez and gently took her hand, leading her to a wall covered with photographs of animals who had been successfully rehabilitated and released. "He's showing you the success stories," Sarah explained. She had moved permanently to the mountain facility after her divorce was finalized, bringing Michael to live in the community that had become home to all of them. "Lucky understands that what we do here matters beyond just his own survival." Dr. Vasquez knelt beside Lucky, speaking to him in the gentle tone reserved for particularly intelligent subjects. "Lucky, do you understand that you're special, that other bears don't learn the way you do?" Lucky chittered softly and pointed to the photograph of his mother, then to Dot, then to himself. The gesture was clear. He understood that his abilities came from trauma transformed into purpose, loss converted into love. "He knows he's different because of what his mother sacrificed," Dot said, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who continued to discover new depths in the relationships that had rebuilt her life. "But he also knows that being different gives him the responsibility to help others." Tommy appeared from the main building, carrying a folder thick with official documents. His hair had grown grayer over the past months, but his face carried the peace of someone who had finally found his way home. The amnesia that had stolen 10 years of his life had also given him the skills to create something beautiful from the wreckage of other people's mistakes. "The paperwork is complete," he announced. "Lucky is officially designated as the first wildlife ambassador bear in North American history. He'll live here permanently, helping to rehabilitate other trafficking victims while serving as a living reminder that intelligence and empathy exist across species boundaries." Emma clapped her hands together, causing Lucky to stand up on his hind legs in response, a trick they'd developed together during her recovery. "Does this mean Lucky gets to stay with us forever?" "Forever's a long time," Dot said gently, but it means Lucky gets to choose his own family, and his family gets to choose him back, for as long as that makes everyone happy. As afternoon faded into evening, the extended family gathered on Dot's porch for their daily ritual of watching the sunset paint the mountains in impossible colors. Lucky positioned himself in the center of the group, close enough to touch everyone who mattered to him. Michael leaned against his mother Sarah, while Emma sat cross-legged beside Bobby's wheelchair. Ben and Tommy flanked Dot on either side, 3 generations of chosen family finding peace in the simple act of being together. "You know what I've learned this year?" Dot said, her voice carrying across the peaceful evening. "Family isn't about who gave birth to you or who shares your DNA. Family is about who shows up when you need them most, who stays when things get difficult, and who loves you enough to forgive your worst mistakes." Lucky made a soft rumbling sound that vibrated through his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something uniquely his own that meant contentment and belonging. "Sometimes," Emma said, scratching behind Lucky's ears, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "the best families are the ones that come together by accident, but stay together on purpose." And in the gathering darkness of the Colorado mountains, surrounded by the sounds of wildlife settling in for the night, a bear cub who had lost everything found exactly what he needed. A family that proved love doesn't require speaking the same language. It just requires speaking the same truth. Sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest fears. When 78-year-old Dorothy thought she was facing a dangerous grizzly bear on that snowy Christmas Eve morning, she was actually meeting the answer to 40 years of prayers for family reunion. Like so many of us in our golden years, Dot had convinced herself that her story was ending, that the empty nest, the quiet dinners, and the gradual loss of purpose were simply facts of aging. But Lucky's arrival proved that God's timing doesn't match our calendars, and that the family we need might not look anything like the family we expected. Emma's courage at 12, Bobby's redemption at 48, and Tommy's return after decades of being lost remind us that it's never too late for second chances, forgiveness, or finding our tribe. Whether you're 55 or 75, whether you're facing empty rooms or health challenges or financial worries, remember that Dot's miracle came when she opened her door despite her fear. Your family, biological or chosen, might be closer than you think, waiting for you to simply say yes to love in whatever form it takes. What unexpected family member has God brought into your life recently? Have you ever felt like Dot, wondering if your best years were behind you, only to discover a new chapter beginning? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how hope found its way to your door.